This is something that has been known to everybody, how the developed world has been at the forefront of exploiting the climate, and the developing world is gradually catching up. And now if you force them to the similar standards of climate justice, then that would be something of an injustice happening. And climate finance is one of the key goals that we have to deliver on, and something that the developed world promised but did not actually work on. And the government also talks about raising the voices of the global south in it. So we have to bring a conclusion to that. Second, when you talk about 66% population and 76% of the world's carbon emissions, another very important aspect that the government launched was Mission Life.
There is a separate UN mechanism, the COP, the negotiations that happen on climate issues, but G20 guidance from the top leadership is of value. Whatever the G20 leaders agree translates roughly into the UN negotiations also, the intergovernmental negotiations. So on climate, I think G20 is unique because we have a bunch of rich industrialized countries that have contributed most of the historical emissions.
Correct.
And then we have a bunch of emerging major economies like India, whose carbon footprint is low, but yet as we industrialize and go forward, we also have to make sure our transition to green happens.
Correct.
So I think G20 is a mix of global north and global south. So that division you spoke about between north and south, G20 is the place to heal it and to find a common ground, and that's something.
For achieving sustainable development goals 2030.
I mean, on paper everyone says it,
Yes.
but it's the proof of the pudding is in eating it.
Yes, yes. Please, next question.
My question is, how is India going to ensure that geopolitical disruptions are not going to impact global supply chains of food and healthcare products?
Okay. Professor Cholya.
Yeah, it's going to be a mammoth task. The point is geopolitical tensions are at all-time high. The point is that we have major rivalries, wars, and weaponization of many things: food, fuel, energy, information, all kinds of. So they're like non-military means by which people are also trying to hurt and harm each other. And this is as a result of interdependence of countries. If you take an action, it has a ricochet effect on everybody else, because we are all interconnected in a single under the so-called globalization rubric. So to find a way to manage these disruptions, we are talking about resilient supply chains and all. Those are individual countries' choices. But collectively as a group, what can we do? I think the number one, my own view, and I've written about it, is some kind of a responsible macroeconomics deal or something like that, wherein our policies are all coordinated in such a way that what I decide in my own self-interest does not lead to harm for the rest of the community. That's the whole idea of the G20, right?
So the intent of G20 chair is very clear. The timings of this particular G20 summit is something Professor Cholya makes it very, very critical also, considering the geopolitical situation across the globe. Now, let me quickly focus on the other aspect. Remember, we talked about, Falit, that this G20 under India's presidency is not going to be the posh affair, posh quote unquote, something between the diplomatics or the head of the states, but it's going to translate into action and percolate to the people's level also. Basically not make it people-centric and most importantly youth-centric, and that's why precisely we are talking about Youth 20. And the granular effect, Professor Cholya, how do we do this? You have urban connect and you have rural connect.
Definitely, ma'am. So with respect to the rural India, what we are trying to do is, first of all, the most important aspect is language. So the way that we are framing the topics here and discussing in English, the same cannot transpire, or the discussion at the rural level cannot happen in this language. So one of the most important targets that we have taken is to convert and translate all of these into rural local languages, and then translate these into discussions at those levels. So for example, if you're talking about health and well-being, you can talk about Gram Swasthya and have G20 or U20 chopals. This is a conception that is in building, where we'll be having these kinds of discussion at the rural level, people discussing about them, documenting their ideas, and then we'd be collecting those and assembling them, and finally making them a part of the communique as the India stance. So this is a very important goal that we have taken, that the stances that India takes and the initiatives are not restricted to the urban level alone, but they drip down to the rural level, and for that, if it requires efforts, we'd be putting in that to make it accessible for the rural population in their language. and not in the elite language that they cannot access.
Okay, and have you, is there a plan in place? Has this work already started? And Professor Cholia, has this kind of an exercise been seen before in other nations under their, presidency?
Not to my knowledge, India, we have very decentralized polity, and the strength is in democracy, right? So we have local self-government at the lowest level, at the village level, and all the way to the top. So definitely our degree of political participation in processes is much higher.
And I think there are panchayats,
absolutely,
a three-tier system.
Absolutely.
Yes.
So I think we have that strength, and we would like our model. See, our financial inclusion schemes which involve the rural public, hundreds of millions, the Jan Dhan Yojana and all those things are worth emulating by
Swachh Bharat, Beti Bachao,
they
Beti
are
Padhao,
also,
yes.
so in a way we are also showcasing our successful public policy initiatives that affect the bulk of the rural society as a model that could, if not emulated, at least observed and take best practices and applied in other G20 countries, So there are a lot of these domestic policy innovations that India has done last 8 years that we are showcasing as models for others to look up.
My question is regarding how women-led development is at the core of India's G20 deliberations. So what are the specific initiatives planned to ensure this, and more specifically, how can the youth help in attaining these goals?
As we just focus on the last answer as well, we'd be having specific women-led discussion groups as part of the Women 20, where each of the engagement groups that are working in, they'd be working in intersection with the Women 20 to have aspects, proposals and collaborations that strengthen the women of India. Whether it's in terms of startups and collaborations and getting them, say, seed fundings, or for example, partnerships with international bodies, or similarly getting international women entrepreneurs to India and facilitating these kind of startup hubs. And also it'll be working on various kinds of platforms and exhibition where our women entrepreneurs, people, women in sciences, they could get different platforms to showcase what they have been doing. So it's not that India has been lacking to some front, but what as a part of the global south we had been lacking in was platforms where we exhibit the work and capability that we have. And this is something that we'd be very particularly focusing on as part of our presidency. And something very interesting that has happened this time is for the very first time, so now G20 works on a concept of troika, where the previous presidency, the current presidency and the next presidency, they work in tandem with each other. This was the first time that the troika is composed of all three developing countries. The previous country, Indonesia, current presidency, India, and the next presidency, Brazil. And this is a unique moment where we can push for the idea of women from the global south who are taking initiative and lead. And this is what we stand for.
Okay, shared vision.
Exactly, ma'am.
Are we going to discuss the use of debt trap diplomacy as a symbol of neo-colonization and how it's affecting their growth in the underdeveloped regions of the world?
Okay, Professor Cholia.
Well, good one. G20 has been at the forefront on issues of LDCs, least developed countries, and debt. There have been guidance given by G20 for waiving or rescheduling debts owed by least developed countries during the COVID-19 pandemic. There was even an emergency G20 summit when the pandemic was at its peak, with a special focus on debt forgiveness or debt waiver or restructuring of debts. Now the G20 advice usually has a lot of weight, even with the other capital markets and the other financial institutions like the IMF and the World Bank. They follow G20 guidance and advice, overall advice.
India, the voice of global south?
Definitely, ma'am. In fact, that's
how we're looking at a reshaping of the world order, Fallin.
Ma'am, also interestingly, the point that she raised about the debt trap diplomacy, this is also what we got in last year's Y20 communique about transparent debts as part of diversity and inclusion. So very important aspect of U20 is that we figure out the key points that we want and getting them as part of the document.
Talk shop.
Exactly.
You've actually done a lot of work.
Yeah. So all of these things have to come into order, and for that we also have to study what are the problems in the debt structure that they're taking. So task for us as youth is to now look into what is the way that they give debt, get into those technicalities, find them out and then call them out. So the global south perspective has to come out in this way through research.
All right, let's have quick questions. I'm going to have now final back-to-back few questions. Yes, quickly.
How does the G20 aim to prioritize these sets of issues which range from war all the way to sustainable development?
They're all equally important. I think they have working groups and mechanisms on all the issues. They have ministerials of different catering to different issue areas. Each of them have their own, and I don't think one is more important than the other. And I think the key point is they're all interconnected. You see, the priority areas is not like they are silos. It's not one different from the other. They're actually all interconnected, and failure on one front will have a spiral, negative spiral that affects the other four. No? So I think we have to go take all of them along, and that's what we mean by this multi-stakeholder multilateralism. Otherwise, it's like navigating a big ship, and you are in a stormy weather. The world is in crisis right now. But if only one side of it is functional, then the water comes in from the other side. We are all sinking, right? So that idea of global governance and collective action is what we are trying to infuse through our G20 presidency.
All right. Yes, quickly.
Under what conditions youth can influence leaders as a decision makers to say no to war? For example, if you see in Russia and Ukraine, people are against the war, population, but state leaders take the decision. Thank you.
Okay. Amin is from Afghanistan, a war-torn nation, and it's really heartening to hear that question from you, and I think it makes a lot of sense. Professor Cholia.
Yeah, our Prime Minister Modi told President Putin directly when they met that this is not the era of war, and we want diplomacy and negotiation and an end to the hostilities. And we have also been telling the Western powers as well, who are supplying Ukraine with heavy weaponry, that the idea that we can win on the battlefield is a no-brainer. It actually doesn't work. It just doesn't make sense, and we need to actually move to dialogue phase and ceasefire at least to start with. So I think G20 communique this time actually mentioned that there is a link between the ongoing wars and the economic suffering that we are seeing worldwide. And G20 was for macroeconomic management, but you cannot ignore the peace and security issues. So I think you will see more and more work behind the scenes diplomatically to try and bridge the differences and at least bring about a sustainable, durable ceasefire before the Indian summit starts in September 2023. I think you will see some action and movement, because there is also fatigue setting in with the two warring parties. And there is a limit to how far they can keep on fighting. So I think we can make a creative intervention. I've been advocating Indian leadership of G20. We in a peace-loving country that's never attacked anybody and doesn't believe in offensive behavior in international relations, are ideally suited with our bridges with all sides to play a matchmaker or a peacemaker. And I think there is an effort going on behind the scenes to create a working group of key G20 countries who together we can try and bring these wars, if not to a complete halt, if not final settlement, at least some kind of initial ceasefire. Cessation of hostilities is good enough to start with, and we have to have small goals and achieve them rather than say I want either everything or nothing. G20 is about the art of possibility. Whatever is practical, and I think to that extent our leadership is seized of the matter and they are giving it top priority. This vertical peace and security is not a marginal thing for G20. It's now becoming central.
Very central. The timings of it. Quick comments. We'll have quick comments. Yes.
Greetings to the panel. My question is that big oil cartels like OPEC, are they a big threat to sustainable development or environment change? Because they control the most percentage of world oil.
Okay. One more quick.
India is also one of the founding nations of the International Solar Alliance. So do you think India should use the G20 presidency to promote the ISA and its mission?
Okay, ISA, oil, and one more comment here. Yes, quickly.
According to you, what's going to be India's economic diplomacy and foreign trade policy with regard to attracting FDI, FPI, and also converting trade deficit into trade surplus?
Okay, please.
How can India use G20 in order to harness the narrow gap of labor force in India?
Okay, let's start from there. Yes, narrowing the labor force.
Okay, look, there are a lot of imbalances in the international global economy, and G20 has always tried to redress the imbalances. Some places there is excess saving, some places there is excess spending. This has led to major crises in the past, and demographic issues are also very much important. There are countries in the G20 like Japan that are facing terminal decline, and then there are others. It's also linked to immigration. Because if you have massive shortages, labor shortages, you need to be open to immigration, right? And some countries are not. On the other hand, we have a labor suppressed country and a young country like India, where average age is just 26. So there are a lot of things we can do to try and create consensus on these issues. And I'm sure that, G20 has become like a kitchen sink in many ways. There are like so many issues now being thrown into it. So I'm sure population dynamics and their long-term impact, it's linked to this industry 4.0 also. Demographic shifts and the technological adaptation, and then how does this to industry 4.0. The question about oil, Russia is a G20 member, Saudi Arabia is a G20 member. These are big players in the OPEC and OPEC plus alliance, and on the other hand, there are big buyers of oil like India, China, United States. These are all consumers. European Union countries, they're all mostly buyers of oil. So there has been a lot of breakdown of energy security, and as a result of major tussles and all these things in the last few years. And we even saw $120 of a barrel for crude oil that caused massive damage even here with regard to rising prices at the gas pump. But I think energy security is an issue for G20. And I think the message has been heard loud and clear. Indonesia highlighted that also during their presidency, and we are going to continue to work on that aspect to try and socialize these countries. If you're members of G20, do your bit. You can't just go narrowly selfish as per your own core interests. You have to think about the group, not just being self-centered, right? So we hope that all of us will impress upon the big cartel. OPEC is a big cartel to actually tone down some of their aggressive price setting and production policies, because otherwise everybody will suffer, and in a way it will come back to harm them, because you cannot enjoy high growth rates if the rest of the global economy is down, and you need to also sell your product. It's not just oil, right? You have to also trade with others. You have to bring in capital from elsewhere. That will not come in if the rest of the world is flat. So think about all of us as, Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam is the official motto of G20 of India, right? World is one family is not a rhetorical thing. If you think about it, we are deeply interconnected and our fates are interconnected. That's what we're going to impress.
And that is India way.
India way.
Well, yes. Quick.
How India will lead G20 in responding to global health emergencies. Like India just had vaccine Maitri, one of the only country to export vaccines through the world during this pandemic. So will we be using our experience to bring out some structural changes?
Okay.
How is India's presidency going to help prevent or suppress the Cold War?
Okay. So we've covered almost everything under the sun. And I think that's precisely, Prime Minister Modi's vision. Then bring them on, bring them in. So I'm going to just throw a very, a central question, because we need to close it here. Professor Cholia and Falit, of course, you. So finally, under the India's G20 presidency, and especially under the banner of Youth 20, we are convinced that India can bring so much to the table. Perhaps India continues to bring so much to the table. What finally, according to you, you've heard all of them, I think all of them spoke. What, according to you, under the G20 Y20 banner is going to be the India way, the India setting, the agenda setting for the subsequent G20s? Like he pointed out, it doesn't have to stop here. This is the beginning, the impact.
So I'd just talk about a very central theme as to how we are approaching all these problems that would answer a lot of those questions. When one of you, I guess, talked about the developed countries are moving towards coal and those questions. So Professor Cholia also pointed out that the world is moving towards excessive and narrow nationalism, and the reason behind that is that countries have gotten embroiled in so many conflicts and everything's being politicized that countries are now trying to become self-sufficient. So now when you talk about the Nord Stream pipeline that transfers maximum gas or energy from Russia to Europe, now they're in a crisis because they are dependent upon it, and now because energy supply has been politicized, they have to go to coal, otherwise they cannot survive. And similar question was with respect to food security as well. Now one of the primary approaches that India is taking, and which was also highlighted in the University Connect speech by the EM Dr. S. Jaishankar, was that India is striving to be the voice that is inclusive and is looking after the interest of everyone, and one of the primary goals of that is depoliticization of food and energy supply chains. The conflict that is happening is a reality. We are also trying to stop it, but in that context we also have to realize that within those conflicts that are taking place, the interest of the world should not suffer. The interest of the poor should not suffer.
The larger interest.
Exactly. And depoliticization of food supply chains, that even if Russia and Ukraine conflict is going on, the food supplies of the rest of the world should not be stopped, or energy supplies of the rest of the world should not be stopped. Otherwise, everybody would be affected. And as is spoken, that when developed countries get polarized, the developing countries suffer, the global south suffers. So we have to look after the interest of everybody, and this is part of the India way to take everybody along.
Excellent. So amidst the you know, all this, the current context, geopolitical context, Professor Cholia, when developed countries become polarized, developing countries may take the lead, and when we talk about who takes the lead under the chairmanship or chair of India G20 presidency, it's going to be again the India way. So the larger deliverables.
We have a philosophy which is about taking everyone along, and not to look at the world in binaries of us versus them. We have you know, non-dualistic approach, you know, to our metaphysics and
so is there
all
going
this.
to be a paradigm shift? Final word.
Yeah, I think we have the acumen, we have the diplomatic preparation is there, the consultation with the youth and with all the stakeholders is there, as we can see, and most importantly the ethos and the practice. We are coming with a different practice and ethos from previous chairs. My view is that this is going to be special. The IMF director was saying that the Indian presidency will make a mark in history. I don't think she was exaggerating, because she understands the depth of the strength and the character of this country, and that is coming to the fore, especially through all these young energies.
So Y20, Youth 20 under G20, I'm just going to sum it up in one line, is all set to make the global mark. Global mark, especially in the G20 settings. On that note, thank you very much all of you for joining us on this special episode of DD Dialogue. Thank you. You were such a wonderful audience. I mean, we're really falling short of time. There were so many points that they wanted to raise with Professor Cholia and Falitz Sajaria. Thank you very much, Professor Cholia, for joining us, and many thanks, Falitz Sajaria, for joining us on the show. So that is it when it comes to India's way, India leading the way, the very India way. From me and my entire team of G20 special series DD Dialogue from the sprawling campus of Global Jindal University. Thank you very much for tuning in. Namaskar.
डिजिटल बैंकिंग का है जमाना, टाइम है बचाना। डिजिटल बैंकिंग है आसान, करो चाहे कोई भुगतान, एनी टाइम एनीवेयर, सेफ है, फास्ट है, हर पेमेंट उंगलियों पे सेट है। लेन देन के हैं ऑप्शंस कई, IMPS, NEFT, UPI भी। 24 घंटे करते ये काम, पेमेंट आसान और रहे आराम। RBI कहता है जानकार बनिए, सतर्क रहिए।
Hello and welcome to yet another episode of Virtual Encounters. I'm Abhishek Mahajan. We have two very special guests today, India women's hockey captain Savita Punya and also India women's hockey coach Yannick Shopman. India recently won FIH Nations Cup. Both are joining us on Virtual Encounters. Welcome both of you. Appreciate you giving us your precious time. Savita, I'll come to you first. Congratulations on winning the Nations Cup title. You defeated Spain in the finals 1-0. First of all, tell us, how big is this for you?
Yeah, thank you so much, first of all. And definitely this tournament is very big for us. And before we going, we just decided like we have to just focus on our game. Like we are not busy with winning or something else, but in our mind, and we just made our goal like, okay, we